My name is Tina Regan, and I've lived in the neighborhood all of my life. If you want a number, I'm not going to contribute. And it was a happy life. We went to school across the street, and my brother went to military school in Virginia, and it really was. The rule on the street was when the lights go on, everybody has to stay. You can be outside, but you're on the street on Bainbridge Ave. And that continued when I brought up our kids, when we brought up our kids. It was a really wonderful place to bring up children. There was an older woman when we first moved there who lived in the house, and she would tell me stories about horse carriages coming down Westminster Street and Broadway, and how the carriage house across the street actually parked carriages, not just theirs, but several other people who owned carriages. You could rent carriages on Sundays to ride around. And she would tell me these stories and serve me tea. I was a little kid. Serve me tea and open a trunk and show me her clothes, long dresses with tiny, tiny waists. And I heard these stories about earlier times, and it was something I always gravitated to, knowing more about earlier times. There was a theater in Owneville, and it was Kahn's Theater. Jakey Kahn's is what all the kids, I don't know if that's a legitimate name, but that's what everyone called it. And if you walk down Westminster Street, and actually when you approached Huntington Avenue, which came out to Westminster Street, there was a fountain in the middle of the street there on Westminster Street. The neighborhood was, as I said before, all around it. And so it was a short walk, and let me see, my best recollection, and we argue about this, that the first time I went, it cost 10 cents to go to the movies. However, I would get a quarter, because my brother was 10 years old. I was like an only child, spoiled. And so we'd walk down and then take a left on Huntington Avenue, because there was a candy factory there. And for the most part, they made hard candy, and they had a tray on the counter when you went. It wasn't really a counter, but they had a tray on the counter there, and paper bags that were twisted on the top. So you could buy a bag of that candy, which were like broken ribbon candy and hard fruit drops and that kind of thing. You could buy that bag for 5 cents. So you bought the bag of candy, and then you went to the movies. And all the kids in the neighborhood would go. It was riotous. I mean, if they laughed, it was like the theater, the building shook, because there were so many kids. I went to RISD because on Saturday mornings they had art classes at the museum. And when I left the house, it was fine that I walked, but my mother would say, don't walk on Benefit Street, because Benefit Street is nowhere where it is now. So I could walk on Westminster Street, no problem. Broadway, no problem. As I said, I could go to the movie house, but I had to be careful on Benefit Street. The streetcars served both Westminster Street and Broadway. And Westminster Street was a very different street than it is now. It was lined from Hoyle Square to the West Broadway neighborhood, Messer Street, with mansions, very much like Broadway. Most of them gone now, but they were fine houses, and it was originally High Street, then later became Westminster Street. And so in the days of being High Street, that's when the mansions and the fine houses were built, and hardly any commercial at that time. And then it began to change when the commercial came in, and I guess that was due to the trolley serving the street. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of pictures of Broadway, early pictures. If you ever come by, let me know, because I'm trying to put something together. But for every gas station that was located in my childhood, it meant a house was lost. That's true of the corner of Batty and Broadway, Toby and Broadway, on both corners. And so that's a sad part of the story, because Broadway represents a time in the history of Providence that was incredible. People came to Broadway having lived on the east side. This was the new suburb. And so many, if you look at the history, many of the families came from the east side, located to Broadway. And then there were a number of recessions that they had to deal with. So sometimes you found that John Carpenter built this house and lived here. And at some point he might have turned it over in his wife's name, his sister's name, so that, they could keep the house. The house might change. It might become a rooming house. Rooming houses were very popular. And it was a respectful way of life, because the owner was in the house, and they usually had rules and regulations that had to be followed. The better the house, the more rules and regulations it had. But so that's, when you see the history and you see how many houses are gone because of the changes in society, it's a sad story. I in my lifetime remember a number of houses. A Greek revival on Broadway, just the second house in from Knight Street, was a magnificent Greek revival, which represents a style of Greek revival. I don't think we have another one in Rhode Island. And I've not seen one beyond Rhode Island like it. It had a wraparound porch with Greek columns around it. Gone. Floor-to-ceiling windows. It was, and so that's what makes Broadway important. It was a main street. It was one of the new suburbs. Barnaby Castle. There's not another story that can be told like Barnaby Castle. It's incredible. So, yeah, that's Broadway. In '67 came a notice from the city that urban renewal was coming in. It's urban renewal, And so people who were interested, a lot of people didn't pay much attention to it. It was something they didn't understand. I went because we had just recently taken ownership of the house. And I went to these meetings, and people were talking about the house next door to me is a mess. It needs a paint job. They keep the trash out in front. They don't keep their property. And someone would go to the map and make an X on that street number. Somebody else would come up with other complaints, and the city people, planning department, and it really wasn't truly a planning department. And this took in West Broadway, so it took in the Armory District and part of Federal Hill, the streets that go over to Atwells Avenue. So it was a mixed group, and probably the neighbors. I've always thought there are invisible boundaries in neighborhoods. A planning department, now they call us Federal Hill. I never lived. The woman who owned our house, if she knew she lived in Federal Hill, she'd be spinning in her grave. But, the planning department did that. And they make boundaries, but the boundaries were different if you lived in a neighborhood. And so those people might not have ever gotten together. People from Gessler Street going to the same meeting as people on Hudson Street or Bainbridge Ave. It just wouldn't happen like that. And so that, I think, was the beginning of the neighbors being concerned with the changes that were going to occur, because there were people who wanted out. They saw this as an opportunity. You know, they were going to be paid fair market. They could get out. They could go to the suburbs. What's better than that in the 60s, going to the suburbs? And they didn't have to maintain these big old houses. So that was an opportunity. And for others, like myself and others, we thought the neighborhood was a good place to stay. But what they were proposing was kind of scary. What was going to happen? And in the end, things like I mentioned, the planners going to the maps and marking X's on it. What did that mean? Well, it meant a lot of the houses were demolished. So that's really how it began. And there, as I say, a handful of people started what we called the West Broadway Homeowners Association. It changed later because there were people who didn't own houses who cared about the neighborhood as much. So it changed. But some fierce battles took place. As I say, some people saw it as an opportunity, and they fought to have their houses gone. Some really nice houses. There was one next to BJ's house that people fought to have torn down. And that was really the situation throughout the neighborhood. The biggest problem at that time, and it may be the biggest problem now, was absentee owner. That was the biggest problem. And it would reoccur, with every meeting, and then, it kind of petered out again because of the 30-somethings coming in. And I can remember one meeting, and I met this kid. I don't know how old he was, maybe 20 years old. And he was looking to buy a house on off Sycamore Street, Hudson Street, yeah. And it was a house that I had sent a niece of mine to look at. I'm talking about BJ. And the house was open. Anyone that had any interest in looking at this house, just open the door and walk in. It was a magnificent house. It had cresting on the roof. No one touched. A few years later, many crested houses lost their cresting. And he was a kid. And he didn't have a Providence background. Now, this is exciting because young people were looking at these houses, and they were going to take them over, and they had the right attitude about what they needed to do, restore the houses instead of modernizing them and stripping everything off. Without the revolving fund and Armor Revival, 3 young guys that got together and were interested in this neighborhood, I don't think there would have been movement like there was. I mean, we can go down, and I do in my tours. That's a revolving fund house, and that's an Army Revival house, and it's like, yes. And that, I think that's really when I was totally involved. I went to work for the Providence Preservation Society. Not much later, actually 1982, I went on the Historic District Commission. You could say I spent a great part of my life dealing with preservation issues. And so here we are today.